an important part of creating interactive experiences is making sure that what we're creating looks very smooth and very performant. And core to that is this idea of frame rate, which refers to the number of still images or frames that are displayed per second in a video or animation. But in the purposes of what we do, we'll be dealing less with video and more with animations, but the concepts between video and animation and how to make them run smoothly are very similar. So let's take a step back and just talk briefly about how did motion get represented back in the day. And the most common way was frames were defined in physical media like film strips, and you might have seen film strips and projectors and so on as part of just your own curiosity in this area. And the idea is that each of those little strips contain a particular frame of a visual, and those are passed through something like a projector or a film system, and this faster they are going through them, ultimately you create the illusion of movement. So you can imagine here's a very classic visual representation of someone riding a horse. You can see each frame represents the movement of the horse in a slightly different form, and as you sequence all these images together and you play them back, you get something that looks very much like this, where what looks like individual film strips, or individual frames, are now put together to create what looks like a more cohesive movement of someone riding the horse and the horse is moving. In our digital world, the world that we live in today, there's a whole lot less dealing with film and physical media than what you might have encountered several decades earlier. It's all done digitally, where our graphics card and our CPU and the memory and all the internals of whether it's a laptop or a desktop or a mobile device like a phone or tablet, all of that is handled where the pixels are digitally represented and they make their way onto a screen, and all of that is done without any kind of physical film-like media or paper being involved at all. It's pretty convenient, and this extends to how they're typically represented as well. Typically for an animation these days, you represent the starting point and the ending point, and that's it. All of the intermediate states are handled by whatever animation system or tool you're using to ultimately generate the animation that you want. So for example, you could be using a tool like Adobe Animate, where you focus on the beginning and the ending points, and the interpolation, all the intermediate frames are taken care of automatically for you. And so that brings us to an important point here. The number of frames per second impacts how smooth the movement ultimately looks like. The more frames per second, the smoother the motion. And here's an example of this. So what I have here is a visualization. I have 60 frames on one side and 24 frames on the other, and they're both displayed over a period of 1 second. Now, what we can kind of see here already is that there's a lot more frames to compress into the 1 second area, which means that a visual that is being played back from over a period of 1 second will be much smoother in the 60 frames world, because the beginning and ending of a frame is significantly compressed, where a brain doesn't have time to figure out where does one end, another one begin, because another frame would have come in to display that intermediate part of the motion. Whereas when you look at 24 frames a second, you'll see it's a lot more sparse. There's a lot less frames there, which means that when the playback is happening in a 24 frames per second world, the movement will be a little bit more slow, more stuttery, or more janky, as you might often see reference to animations that are not particularly smooth. Now, to help highlight this, the visual is great, but let's look at an interactive example. I created a page at the URL framerate.dev, and let's take a look at it. And what you'll see on this page, you'll see a burger happily animating from left to right, and we have a frame rate picker right here. Right now it's set to auto, which means it's going to run at the fastest possible frame rate this particular device I'm on will support, which is often gated by how fast our monitors can handle redrawing the screen, in which case it's 60 hertz. 60 frames a second is what the translation is. And it's pretty smooth. You can see that the burger's moving. I don't really see any kind of delay or jank. Now let's go ahead and reduce it from 60 frames per second to 30. What you'll see as the frame rate is adjusted is that the animation itself still takes the same amount of time to complete. The burger takes the same amount of time to go from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. What is different though is that each frame of the burger, there's just fewer frames to work with in a per second basis, and you can see there's a little bit more stuttering, a little bit more jank. And if I go to 15, it's more pronounced. You can see that the individual frames are much more obviously visible, and the jerkiness and the janky motion is much more obvious as well. And if I go to 5, you're going to be like, this is absolutely unusable. You can see each frame almost to the point where you can count as it is moving from one side to the other. And so this is just a more accurate representation of the more frames you have, the smoother your animation will be. And in the description below, I have linked to more articles that go into detail on how to ensure your frame rates are consistently smooth across a variety of devices, where some might have 120 frames per second as their maximum capability, others might have something lower, and making sure that everything looks pretty good. But with that, we have a good spot here where we looked at all the various variables that go into creating smooth movement, of which the biggest one really is the frame rate. And I hope this gave you an overview of both how frames represented historically and how much progress we made over the years into being able to handle all these things digitally, to the point now where we just write some code in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then we have things moving in an interactive way, either for an animation or for a game or any kind of visual that is changing state from one to the other. So if you have any questions about frame rates or just development in general, post on the forums at forum.crypto.com, where I and others will be happy to help you out. Feel free to subscribe to my newsletter, where I go into great detail on various topics related to business, design, and technology. 3 things I feel would be very interesting for you. And if you want bite-sized updates as I'm coming up with things, or just have thoughts I want to share, follow me on Twitter. My URL and name is just Krupa. Pretty convenient. And if you enjoy my style of explaining things, and if you enjoy reading my content online, I also take a lot of my best content and put them in book form, both in paperback and Kindle editions. So check those out. They make great gifts. And if you have a wobbly chair or table, they also make great stops that allow you to prevent the wobbliness by just putting a physical book under the wobbly leg, and you're good to go. So how about that? And with that, I'll see you all next time.